Welcome back to Counterpoint. Joining me now is Gregory Wrightstone, and we're unpacking climate change and specifically the purported benefits of CO2, which we've heard contrary to that for the last number of years. So let's unpack that, Gregory. We frequently, as I've said, hear that CO2, carbon dioxide, is harmful to the environment, that it increases climate change. Yet you suggest, again, in your book here, that we are in fact benefiting from an increased CO2. And that sounds like a radical concept. So could you please explain?
Well, the easiest thing to point to is really what we call the greening of the earth. Vegetation, again, we just talked about photosynthesis requiring CO2. So the more CO2, actually, the better. The plants and the crops that we rely on for our food, these evolved at times when CO2 levels were 4 and 5 times as much as they are today. So these plants evolved needing and requiring more CO2 than we have. So the more CO2 we have, the faster they grow, the bigger they grow. Other things like they can fight drought better with more CO2. There's more soil moisture because they're taking less soil out of the or less water out of the soil. Lots of benefits. We can see that crop growth and crops are by virtually every country around the world, from the coldest to the warmest, are benefiting from modest warming. And just think about this. It's easy to think if you're in Norway or Canada, if it's warming, it's warmed about a little less than a degree in 1 century, but that warming lengthens the growing seasons. So crops are killing frost and earlier in the spring and arrive later in the fall. And so if you're in Alberta or Saskatchewan, that wheat crop you can plant it earlier, and you can maybe get a couple harvests in. And then the CO2 is just turbocharging that with CO2 fertilization effect powering plant growth.
Now, as a Canadian, of course, I will not complain for an increase in temperature. But what about those who live in equatorial countries? Is there a drawback to even raising the temperature by 1 degree, as you said, in this past century?
Yeah, well, the fact of the matter is, it's the subtropical regions around the equator that see the least amount of greenhouse-driven warming, and it's the poles that get the most, where they really need it the most. And we see countries. We've got a research associate, Vijay Jayaraj, lives in southern India. He writes a lot about crops in India, and even a warm, really hot country like India, my Lord, there's just crop after crop after crop is just breaking records year after year. That's to be celebrated, and we should welcome that. Because of modest warming and increased CO2, we're able to feed a much larger and growing population. Again, that's something that we should celebrate.
So then why is CO2, why has it become demonized by climate change activists? Why did they latch onto CO2 if there seemingly is no negative based on what you said?
Well, because all of the fossil fuels, our economies, the Western economies, capitalism, it's based on inexpensive, abundant, reliable, affordable energy. And we get that from coal, oil, and natural gas. Somewhat nuclear, but it's these renewables that are not reliable. That's the main drawback with renewables, wind and solar. They're not reliable. They're not abundant, and they're not affordable. If you look at the full cost of the life cycle of these renewable facilities, and you ask me why are they basically what your question is, why are they lying to us? And I don't. You can't really. I can't look inside men's and women's souls to see what their motivations are. What I can do is say, okay, this is what they're telling you, and this is what the facts are. And as a scientist, that's my role. And so we just heard it last week with Greta Thunberg, that didn't attend the COP conference. She said this isn't really about environmentalism. We need to get rid of the capitalist system and remake it. We just saw it over in Egypt, Sharm el Sheikh, at the big meeting that's just concluded. They're talking about the same thing. John Kerry's talking about the Great Reset and how COVID, he actually stated that COVID gave us a great model that we should be using for climate crises and climate control. We saw how easily people were manipulated by using the COVID crisis to do this. And he came out and said, he put the words out there and actually stated that this is a great model that we should use for climate.
Ah, wow. And that for our viewers, John Kerry, former Secretary of State, or is he still currently the Secretary of State?
No, he's the what they call the climate envoy for the United States. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but it probably is not anything that's beneficial to the economies of the United States or Canada.
Okay, well, we're going to pick up this discussion in just a few moments when we return. Stick around.